Guns and the gun issue, including traveling to Chantilly, Virginia at the Blue Ridge Arsenal gun shop. And we heard from gun rights advocates. Today we want to hear from one of the shooting victims from Virginia Tech in 2007, somebody that Vice President Joe Biden met during his hearings and meetings in advance of the White House announcement that came on January 16th with the president's proposals and recommendations on ways to curb gun violence in the country. The Vice President also in attendance. Here's a portion of what he said.
During the meetings that we held, we met with a young man who's here today. I think Colin Goddard is here. Where are you, Colin? Colin was one of the survivors of the Virginia Tech massacre. He was in the classroom. He calls himself one of the lucky seven. And he'll tell you he was shot 4 times on that day, and he has 3 bullets that are still inside him. And when I asked Colin about what he thought we should be doing, he said, I'm not here because of what happened to me. I'm here because of what happened to me keeps happening to other people. And we have to do something about it. Colin, we will. Colin, I promise you, we will.
The Vice President last month, and we want to welcome Colin Goddard to C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
A shooting victim and now involved in the Brady campaign. Let's go back, though, to April of 2007. What happened?
It was a Monday morning, 9 a.m. French class during that dreadful hour early, and got to class. You know, things were normal. About halfway through class, though, another girl in our class came in late, and, you know, this was one of the best students in the class. So when she kind of took her seat, we looked at her and said, Rachel, what gives? You know, class is halfway done. Why'd you come? And she turned around and she said, well, there was a shooting in my dormitory this morning, and the whole building was on lockdown. They wouldn't let anyone come or go, and I kept telling them I had class to get to, and they finally said, okay, you're free to go. So I came straight here. We looked at her like, what? Like, there was a shooting on campus, and, you know, we hadn't been told about this? I mean, earlier that school year, you know, it started with a shooting of William Morva around Blacksburg, and they canceled classes pretty quickly. But, you know, we thought that, well, okay, you know, they let Rachel go, so things must be all right. And probably wasn't 5 minutes after that where we first heard this loud, like, bang, 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 coming from somewhere outside of, seemingly our building. I mean, they were doing construction on a building just adjacent to ours the whole semester, and we had heard all sorts of weird noises, and we just chalked it up to more construction. And continued, and then seconds later the bangs got much louder, much closer. You could tell this was something, you know, in our building, in our hallway. Teacher went to look, and immediately as soon as she opened the door, she slammed it shut, and she turned to all of us and said, you know, everybody underneath your desk, somebody called 911. And for the first time in my life, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, basically gave out my information of where I was. I think someone's shooting a gun in Norris Hall. I wasn't really sure what was going on when we saw bullets coming through our door. And at that point, everyone hit the floor, and it was probably the longest 10-minute experience of my life that followed. I mean, for me, it felt like hours of just constant gunfire, and it was really soon after that that, you know, I didn't see much of what was going on, but all of a sudden I felt like someone had kicked me as hard as I'd ever been kicked in my life, above my left knee, and that feeling kind of faded into this kind of burning, stinging sensation that kind of then faded into this wetness, warmth, and then it kind of went numb from head to toe. And, you know, there was that moment when I felt that physical sensation, and I smelt the propellant, you know, which to me smelled like fireworks, was when I kind of came full circle and realized, like, I just got shot. Like, this is real. And you know, like I said, the rest of the time is kind of a blur. I was very conscious throughout the whole experience, but I don't quite remember everything 6 years later. But I know at the end I had been shot 3 more times, twice in my hips and once through my shoulder. And the last time I was shot was probably one of the last gunshots I heard. And you could tell the police had entered our building and really close. Actually, my phone call was the only one made from one of the 3 rooms that had victims. And when I let the phone go during the course of the shooting, it landed next to a girl lying next to me. She picked it up and tucked it underneath all of her hair and actually remained online with the police and directed them to us. So finally, once they entered the room, I expected him to engage the police, but the first thing I heard them say is, shoot her down. And that's when I realized the last gunshot I heard was the one he gave to himself in the front of our classroom. And so, you know, police began a triage of the students, trying to pull out the injured ones who they could. And, you know, they heard, this person's yellow, we have a red, and then I heard black tag, black tag, black tag. And I realized some of my classmates were dead. And you know, they pulled me out, got me into an ambulance, I got to the hospital. The first one in our campus was already full, so they had to drive me down to Roanoke. And spend 6 days in the hospital and a couple months of physical therapy, but ultimately went back to Virginia Tech and graduated, just like every injured student, actually.
What about your French teacher?
My French teacher was found behind our classroom door. You know, she probably was one of the first ones shot, and honestly, it was probably the most difficult loss that I had that day. Most of my close friends in the class were kind of sitting next to me, so the 7 people out of that room of 17 who survived were all located kind of where I was in the back right corner of the room. But for my French teacher in the front of the classroom, she was the first target.
You then graduated, and a couple of years later, you were watching on CNN another shooting that took place in upstate New York in Binghamton.
Yeah.
What did you see, and what was your reaction to that?
It was April 3rd, 2009, almost 2 years after the shooting that I had been involved with, and I had learned a great deal during that 2-year time about how this situation I was involved with came to be, the school policies and how the school knew this student, and mental health policies and gun policies, how this person was allowed to buy a gun despite having a federal record that prohibited him from doing so. He had a mental adjudication. And I had not seen other shootings. I couldn't watch them up until that point, but just how I kind of naturally turned on the TV that morning and saw the story break, I couldn't turn away. And I just sat there and watched the news unfold throughout the course of the day and thought, this is how the whole world saw what happened to me, and now I'm seeing it happen to somebody else, and yet we changed nothing, and there have been no substantive progress in terms of gun policy or mental health policy, and things are dead on arrival in Congress. And I was kept hearing that, and I was like, what gives? And finally, that was just kind of the end of that day was just kind of my tipping point. And at that point, I said, look, I have to do whatever I can to address this issue to help reduce the likelihood that what happens to me happens to somebody else. And I became involved with the Brady campaign and been involved with them ever since.
The NRA has argued that if we had armed guards in the school, or if students had access to guns, that could prevent these type of mass shootings. Your thoughts?
I've heard that a lot, and I try to think back to that morning and realize that the only thing I really knew that morning is that I really didn't know what was going on, and I just don't think that we should be taking our first step at how to reduce these kinds of shootings at the last possible second. I mean, when I learned that we don't even do background checks on all gun sales in this country, I was frankly shocked. I mean, I assumed that we did, and so I think that there's far more we can do in advance to help stop someone with a dangerous mental illness and a gun from coming together in the first place that we don't do currently, that we need to look at first. And I don't really think America's going to shoot our way out of our shooting problem. And we have to look at other ways, more preventative ways, to get the people that need help, the help that they need, and as well as keeping dangerous people away from guns to begin with.
A couple of personal questions, and then we'll get to your calls and comments as we take a look at guns and gun violence and the debate that is front and center here in this country. Did you return to the classroom?
I did. That was difficult, to sit in a classroom again and try to be normal and not freak out whenever kid comes in late or someone slams the door, and it was tough in the beginning, but ultimately after that last year I was somewhat comfortable again. I mean, I'll always now kind of think of my exit whenever I go in a public place. I mean, I think that's just kind of a piece that's forever changed, but ultimately I graduated a happy Hokie and got my degree. How
did it change the Virginia Tech campus?
I think it really brought the community together. I think a lot of people were expecting people and students to transfer and not have a large incoming class, but I think the opposite actually happened. And my sister, who was going to go to a different school in Virginia, actually applied to Virginia Tech and chose Virginia Tech as her school. She's there now. It really. I know that there's a whole new kind of wave of students there now. Not the ones who were there when I was there, but I still meet people today whenever I wear a Virginia Tech shirt. People say, "Oh, did you know anybody? Were you there?" And it's. Unfortunately, it's been a bad mark on our school, but I think that there are so many good things that have spawned from that, that our school will be known for the legacy that we leave afterwards and what we've chosen to do after the fact.
A question from Tony on our Twitter page. On a personal note, how are your injuries today? Hopefully you have made a full recovery.
I have. And I think that goes a long way to help kind of my mental and emotional recovery. I can do everything I did before. I went skiing in Jackson Hole, Wyoming a few weeks ago with friends. There are some people, though, who, who can't do those things anymore, who wake up in the morning and see a different face in the mirror every day, and they're kind of in a different place with all this. So I mean, I feel really fortunate and really lucky to have the recovery that I did, which I think allowed me to ultimately get to the point where I can become an advocate for some changes in this country and be able to share my story with people like you and your viewers.
Why do you think we have had a series of mass shootings, whether it's Virginia Tech, Aurora, Colorado, Newtown, Connecticut? Why is this happening?
I think you could probably write a book in finding that answer, and I don't think there's any one reason. But I'd say a part of that deals with easy accessibility to firearms. I mean, unfortunately, there are too many people who leave their guns accessible to their children or those with dangerous mental illness at home. I mean, there are too many people who sell guns to strangers without background checks. Those are two areas that I think just make so much common sense that we should change and we should improve. That's why I wanted to work with the Brady campaign and do this work. Spend time up here in Congress. I think there's a lot of factors, but I think the one that separates us from the rest of the modern industrialized world is our easy availability and accessibility to firearms.
Let me just share with you and our audience some numbers. We should point out these are 2011 numbers, the most recent we were able to obtain from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but gives you a sense of the amount of firearms sold in any given year here in the U.S. Pistols, 2.6 million, 2.3 million rifles, 862,000 shotguns, 573,000 revolvers, and another 190,000 labeled as miscellaneous firearms. What do these numbers tell you?
I mean, we in America like to buy guns. I think it's been a part of our culture. It's part of our tradition. I understand that. I mean, I was Army ROTC cadet for the first 2 years of school, but I think that there are some simple changes, like namely doing a background check on every gun sale, that I think will go a long way to keeping the Second Amendment for the people who it was intended for, and keeping guns out of the hands of people who have no business having them in the first place.
The event on January 16th, in which the president outlined his agenda items with regard to guns and gun violence. Here are basically the bullet points. Number one is requiring background checks for all gun sales. Also, a new ban on what they describe as military-style assault weapons. Also, limiting the magazines to 10 rounds. And stronger punishing for drug trafficking, as well as improving gun tracing data. With all of this, what is likely to pass?
I think at this point, really everything is on the same page. We're trying to talk about every single part of the president's proposals. And I mean, we realize that there's not just one thing we can do or one solution to gun violence that's going to save everyone's life, but rather we need a comprehensive set of laws and policies in place that legitimately and take seriously keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And so, I think now initially, we're hearing finally some, getting some movement in the Senate, having hearings. So, this process will continue and we'll see what goes down. But right now, we think everything is equally as important. We need to do everything that we can, not just one thing or another thing, but we need to have a comprehensive approach to this problem.
Mark, but physically, have you felt different since the shooting?
I think it's, one of the questions I get a lot, how have you changed? And I think most of my high school friends probably think I'm the same guy I was back then. But one thing is I noticed markedly is movies and films, especially with violence. I kind of disconnect when I see, particularly with gun violence in films, and I think of how did the director or producer choose to portray this scene? Is this just a bullet to the head and the person's off screen and you never see him again, or do they make an attempt to kind of show the intense, gruesome reality of what it's like when a bullet enters a body? And then emotional parts of movies, kind of get me. A little earlier, and I could feel getting choked up. But that's the one thing that I've noticed is the biggest change. But I think physically, I'm got a couple scars, but I'm pretty much the guy I was.
The issue of background checks is the subject of a story this morning, front page of the Denver Post, guns getting into the wrong hands, and pointing out this figure that from 1999 through 2011, an average of 3,600 guns nationwide were sold to people who did not pass their background check, that according to the FBI.
All right, it's a big problem. We have a background check system that applies to some gun sales from dealers, but not all gun sales from private individuals, and as well has missing records, like in the case of Virginia Tech. So we really need to make improvements in the system by one, making sure all the missing records are in that system, and you have to look at that state by state by state, looking at making sure the states are sending their records over to the FBI national system. And then also, if we did that and made sure every record was in there, but we don't require everyone to go through that background check, what's the point? What are we doing? So we have to increase the scope to make sure that every sale encompasses a background check. You know, and so I think, you know, those are just so common sense, you know, low-hanging fruit issues that, you know, that's where we need to come around on this, and that's, you know, one of the things that should be done first and should have been done years ago.
You talked about the shooting in 2009 in Binghamton, New York. This is from one of our viewers saying 20 kindergartners woke me up. Was Newtown, Connecticut a game changer?
I think so. I mean, 2012 was a tough year for mass shootings. I mean, we started with the shooting at Chardon High School in Ohio. I mean, we started. And then we saw the mass shooting in the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. We saw, you know, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and then I think the Sandy Hook was just kind of the last big bang on the crescendo of gun violence that year. And I think, like I said, it was a tipping point for a lot of people. And you know, it's horrible in some ways, and it really upsets me why it takes something so bad to cause a conversation to start. But you know, I kind of have to put that aside and say, well, here we are. You know, let's go do something with this.
How many students were in the class? How many were shot? And how many were killed?
There were 17 people in that classroom, including my teacher, and I am one of 7 people who are still alive. There were 32 people killed that morning, about another 19 or so injured from gunfire, and then another 3 or 4 injured from jumping out of the second-story window and breaking their ankles or their legs on the way down. And then there were many, many more what I consider emotionally injured, not just physically, who, you know, witnessed everything, but, you know, physically remained unscathed. And you know, it changed the community. But you know, I think for anyone who deals with hardship in their life, or something comes out of left field and turns their whole life upside down, you know, you don't have to be remembered for those horrible events that you had no control over. You know, I think what's a better definition of your character and who you are is how you choose to pick yourself back up, how you choose to get up and move forward, and what you choose to do from those days forward. You know, I think that reflects better on who you are as a person. And you know, like I said, when you find a way to put it towards something positive, you know, it's a good example, and you know, it's a way to, like I said, leave the world in a better place than you found it.
Colin Goddard, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.